The way that anti-racist politics operates now is also a vehicle for trying to convince poor black people to identify with rich black people instead of with other poor white people.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
We've got a great show for you today, folks. We're really excited about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm definitely excited to have Professor Adolph Reed Jr. on the show. I know he is a controversial guest, apparently, I'm hearing, but I, for one, really appreciate him being on the show. And as we get ready to bring him on, I did want to take a moment to share the description of his latest book, The South, Jim Crow and Its Afterlives, just to sort of ground the conversation and to let folks know about this book, which I was a big fan of. So, the last generation of Americans with the living memory of Jim Crow will soon disappear. They leave behind a collective memory of segregation shaped increasingly by its horrors and heroic defeat, but not a nuanced understanding of everyday life in Jim Crow America. In the South, Adolph L. Reed Jr., New Orleans, political scientist, and according to Cornel West, the greatest democratic theorist of his generation, takes up the urgent task of recounting the granular realities of life in the last decades of the Jim Crow South. Reed illuminates the multifaceted structures of the segregationist order. Thanks to his personal history and political acumen, we see America's apartheid system from the ground up, not just its legal framework or systems of power, but the way these systems structured the day-to-day interactions, lives, and ambitions of ordinary working people. The South unravels the personal and political dimensions of the Jim Crow order, revealing the sources and objectives of this unstable regime, its contradictions and weaknesses, and the social order that would replace it. The South is more than a memoir or a history. Filled with analysis and fascinating first-hand accounts, the book is required reading for anyone seeking a deeper understanding of America's second peculiar institution and the future created in its wake. So, Professor Reed, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, well, good morning, brothers, and thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure. I got to tell you, I had to pause for a second. It's ridiculous to make sure that we aren't in the same time zone. And then I just you remembered all those years of driving through LaGrange, Georgia, on I-85, going from Atlanta to New Orleans, and I was reassured.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So some folks listening, I'm sure, are familiar with your work, but some not so much. You've had a long career studying and advocating for the working class. So could you introduce yourself and just talk a little bit about your work over the years, and in particular, why you have spent so much of your time studying the working class?
Well, yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, I'm not sure where to begin, although I was forewarned and had time to think about it. But I'll say this, I lived through, I was born in 1947, which is pertinent. And I lived just about full time in the South from about a year after the Brown decision till the end of the 1970s, till near the end of the first year of the Reagan administration. And I lived between Arkansas, Louisiana, North Carolina, and Georgia, and worked a lot in South Carolina during that same period. So my personal biography, I guess, covers most of what's now called the Deep South. And I grew up during the period, the last decades of the Jim Crow order, when it had begun to unravel both internally and in response to external pressures, though none of us at the time realized that it was unraveling, or at least very few people did, and I certainly wasn't one of them. Why I've been interested in the working class? Well, I mean, well, I shouldn't be coy. Like, I came from a left-leaning family, so it was like natural for me. I'll tell you something funny. When at the beginning of this century, Michael Walzer, editor of Dissent, approached me about writing something for an occasional feature that they had called "Why I'm Still on the Left," and I said, "Sure, I'll do it." And then I tried to write about it, or I tried to write it, and then tried to think about it, and I realized I didn't have any answers that went beyond, well, where else would I be, right? I mean, there's like, in the words of have to edit this, I guess, for radio, but in the words of an old textile organizer in North Carolina in the late 50s, you either work for the MF, or sorry, you either own the MF or you work for it. And
Right.
I've never been part of the group that owns it, so
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, I've always said my philosophy in life is that I'm not better than anybody else and ain't nobody else better than me. And that's just sort of my approach. And I think that really, is something that resonates in your work as well. And before we get into the book and some of the themes there, I did want to start with labor issues since we are a union radio show. And I think, we're experiencing this upsurge, or at least it seems like we're experiencing an upsurge with the labor movement. We've got new industries like breaking into Amazon and Starbucks, record public approval of unions, and we've gotten some militant reformers elected to office in the UAW, the Teamsters, the reform movements elsewhere. So what do you make of this current moment for labor?
Well, yeah, it's an important question, obviously. I mean, look, I know there's some people out there who think that I don't want anybody ever to be happy. Right? But the reality is, no, these are good signs. These are all good signs. There's some not so good signs too, like what's happening politically, and with the Supreme Court, clearly, like most recently in the Teamster case. The thing, one thing I've been saying for a long time now is that progressive, leftist, activist, whatever we're supposed to be, you have to stop acting like an advertising agency, by which I mean we have to stop. And although I know people want things to feel good about and to feel encouraged, we have to stop this practice of proclaiming victories at the very beginning of a struggle, right? And all these signs that you mentioned and others are good and hopeful signs. But, the thing about the historic significance of something is that it can only be determined by the passage of history itself or playing out of the history itself, right? So they're good possibilities. They're important possibilities, and we should be encouraged by them as little openings that we can maybe build on and eventually get to building the thing that we actually need to turn the country around. Right.
Absolutely. I mean, I think at this point, after so many years of neoliberal domination, just little openings, these little openings are hopeful. What do you see in terms of the South? What's our role, in this working class movement today?
Well, that's also very interesting. As you know, I mean, there are groups that have been calling for organizing the South for a long time. I mean, from one perspective or another, going back to Operation Dixie at the end of World War II, but more recently from groups like Black Workers for Justice and the Southern Workers Assembly now, which is an interesting formation to pay attention to, right? And it's certainly been the case that if we can crack that nut, right, then we're in good shape. Like if you want to add to the list of little victories along the way, and this is kind of tooting our own horn, but we're in the Labor Party. We actually won a ballot line for a South Carolina Labor Party in 2006, and we did it by gathering more than 16,000 signatures of registered voters in the state who signed a petition calling on the Secretary of State to recognize a Labor Party. And we worked mainly at flea markets and other places where working class people congregated. Right, there's no point going to the
country clubs, right? Yeah,
right. But what we heard from a lot of people, right, without regard to age, gender, or race, was that they thought it was about time that there was some group trying to make a political expression, an official political expression in South Carolina that focused on the things that working people are really concerned about in their daily lives: jobs, healthcare, housing, education, and so forth. And that's the big thing, right? That's the big point for us. Or for us all to recognize, like in the South. And I mean, I mean, these days, since I retired, actually a little before I retired, I've been kind of splitting my time between Philadelphia and New Orleans. So I've spent a lot more time paying attention to Louisiana politics on a daily basis than I have in a long time. And one of the things I've noticed is that in the same way that race worked for the planter merchant in investor class at the end of the 19th century, to drive a wedge between black and white workers, right? And race combined with violence and intimidation and brutality, right? It kind of does the same thing now, but in different ways. I mean, obviously, a lot of the so-called culture war stuff, does that work, and I'm often given the sense that it feels a little bit now like what it must have felt like to be alive in 1895, watching this, right? Watching this shell game, right? That the ruling class, there I call them by their right name, is trying to run on all the rest of us, but with this inflammatory rhetoric. 1895 was the N word. Now it's kind of subtly the N word, but it's also stuff like, I don't know, the pedophile, cannibal, transgender,
or
school librarian.
Professor Reed, one word that we heard last week from one of Alabama's senators is inner city school teacher.
Oh, wow. There you go. Yeah, bingo. And by the way, like, it's kind of interesting. Your listeners might find it interesting to reflect on this. Just when did school teachers go from being highly respected, right, and appreciated, to being demons, right? That didn't happen overnight. It feels like it did, but it was also the product of a long stealth campaign, and maybe not so stealth, right? With fat corporate interests who want to destroy government and public goods, cultivating politicians like your former failed Auburn football coach and others to push against this line over and over and over and over. Gordon Lafer's book, The 1% Solution, which is the study of these corporate front organizations and their moves state by state to try to poison the well of collective goods, is a must-reading for everybody who is interested in these matters. But on the South in particular, right? Like I've said, I think I say this in the book too, that people often talk about what makes the South different from the rest of the country. Why is the labor movement weak in the South? And they talk all kinds of smack about Southern culture and this, that, and the other, and natural Southern conservatism. Well, I have a much simpler explanation, right? And it's that the successful defeat of the populist insurgency and disfranchisement of over 90% of black voters in the South, but also, depending on the state you were in, as many as a quarter to a third of white voters, kind of shifted the playing field very much in politics, that is to say, very much in favor of large corporate interests and planters and that class, and they got to rewrite the rules of government and of politics to favor their interest and exclude everybody else. And for all those decades, that the Democratic Party, what was the only party in most states in the South, and it was an open question as to whether the Democratic Party was the above ground wing of the Klan or the Klan was the paramilitary wing of the Democratic Party. It probably changed on a daily basis. There was no space, or there was very little space, for pro-labor voices to be expressed in politics whatsoever. And to the extent that a quote white, end quote, working class was able to express itself in politically at all. It had to be entirely on terms that were defined by the ruling class, and that wasn't the case in many states outside the South, like in the industrial Midwest and in the Northeast. Right, there were very few. They were very, very rare. Like the one that comes to mind is Mayor Fitzpatrick in New Orleans, who was mayor when the successful 1892 general strike happened, who fought for the workers. And by the way, it was an interracial strike, and succeeded. But he stood with the workers against the business community and the police and the state militia and the governor, who tried to break the strike with racist rhetoric, basically. But there was very little of that in the region. So when you think about 1929 and the great textile uprising of 1934, there were no local officials there who weren't on the side of the mill owners, for instance, right? So like there was no space for pro-labor sentiment to sustain itself. And then and like then almost all the southern states jumped on the opportunity opened for them by Section 14B of the Taft-Hartley Act that let them, declare their states as right to work for less states, which practically all the states in the former Confederacy are now, I believe. And that made it harder for unions, right? So the fact of the matter is, people in the South want representation, want rights on a job, just like everybody else does, right? But the irony here, right, is and this connects with something else I suspect we may talk about later on. But the ways that how we talk about race and how we talk about American politics have been separated from each other makes it harder for us to see that the move nominally against blacks, but it was really a move against the entire working class at the end of the 19th century, is what created a political order in the South that first of all made Jim Crow possible, right? But also stifled the possibilities for development of the trade union movement right over the next century plus.
Yeah, there's a lot there that jumps out at me, honestly, and one of the things that is on my mind, of course, is Alabama, and something I've shared on the show previously is that in my assessment, we are living in the shadows of the defeat of those populists at the turn of the century, and we are still living with the 1901 Constitution that was enacted to enshrine white supremacy and the rule of the big mules, they were called, the big wealthy interests who run this state and who still run this state. And something else you mentioned that I was going to ask about later, but you brought it up about the Labor Party, experience in South Carolina. And, for folks outside Alabama, just for context, it's worth knowing that in Alabama, we are a one-party state. The GOP controls a supermajority of the legislature, the executive, judicial branch. We historically have always been a one-party state. It just was the Democrats for most of that history.
The right-wing Democrats,
right. The right wing has always been in control, except for brief glimmers of hope during Reconstruction or the populist era. So as it stands now in Alabama, we have a situation where there's basically one functioning party. The Democrats don't even really exist as a viable second party. Working class people have no representation. 60% of the electorate doesn't even participate in elections. And I'm just wondering, what those of us in Alabama could maybe learn from the Labor Party experience, that the national experience in the 90s, as well as the Labor Party experience in South Carolina, if there's anything there that, maybe we need to borrow from here in this current moment.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. And it might sound kind of odd because I guess the three, living people who were the most central in running the labor, how should I put this? Administering the day-to-day affairs of the Labor Party nationally, all would say the same thing now, that that it was an important experiment. We took our shot, and we learned what we could learn. We obviously at some point are going to have some kind of political expression that represents and speaks for and speaks exclusively for the working class, basically. But now's not the time to talk about trying to build one. But I guess a better way to put it is what the focus should be. And like, this is what it was like for us at the end of the 80s and the very beginning of the 90s when I got involved, was to try to build a foundation, right, within the institutional labor movement, and one might say within other working class institutions, right, such as they might be, that could eventually develop towards some expression like a political party, right, or an electoral. I mean, not even necessarily an electoral party, right, but the key point is that no matter what the vehicle is, it's just as true now as it was when we started that the Democratic Party is at best an inadequate, or is at best inadequate as a voice for working people's interest, and less so. And I think that's one of the lessons to take from what we've seen happen since 2016, like in American politics, right? That what happens when no political force addresses working people's interests and concerns directly, it is that the door is left open for all kinds of dangerous forces to fill that void. And that's what's been happening. I mean, our founding brother, Tony Mazzocchi from the old oil, chemical, and atomic workers, said this very powerfully on many occasions, that if we, as putative voices of the working class political interest, can't produce credible interpretations of why people are suffering and their lives are and their living standards are falling, and credible approaches to trying to correct it. We know the neoliberals can't and won't and don't care, and that will just leave the door open to these dangerous elements. So from that perspective, I think the most important thing for us now is to do stuff like you guys are doing, right? But to do it also like in our personal networks, because ultimately that's where you have the most influence, right? I mean, with people, is people in your own, networks, and trying to agitate and do worker education, basically political education about, what's actually going on, how the system works, how to think about their own interests, right? And work with people, right? And in the course of struggling with them around their own concerns. And I mean, sort of unfortunate thing mainly, but it's got a couple of benefits, is that we need to start out, I think, by saying that we don't have anything like that, right? And all the, national organizations and the publications and stuff and the political groups who purport, to represent working people's voices don't, right? And that where we are, I've often said lately, is that we're like at the very beginning of an organizing campaign, right? So what we're trying to do, what we need to do, is like start trying to, in addition to whatever else we have to do to stop the bleeding. Don't get me wrong, but we have to. But the task is trying to identify like-minded brothers and sisters, right inside, the class broadly understood, to function as a committee, right, and to keep broadening the base, because we don't have one, and I mean, well, I'll make a little plug for my friend Jane McAlevey, like in her I think it's a penultimate book, No Shortcuts. She makes a very important distinction between mobilizing and organizing. And what that distinction comes down to is that mobilizing is kind of getting people who are already connected with to do stuff, right? Like to go vote or support a campaign or whatever. Where organizing is principally about connecting with people whom you don't already know, you don't already agree with everything about, and trying to broaden that base. And what we need is organizing now, more than anything else.
Absolutely. And just a reminder for folks on the radio, we're talking to Professor Adolph Reed Jr. He is the author of the book, The South, Jim Crow and Its Afterlives, which is part autobiography, part memoir, part history of the South. You mentioned in here that you're really the last age cohort to have had a real memory of Jim Crow. And I'm really excited to dig into this, but since we're on the present and talking about the Labor Party and what it means and the political situation today, you know, Adam, you have an experience more than me about the Alabama Democratic Party and the Alabama Democratic Conference, and I'm wondering if we could go ahead and tackle that question.
Sure. Yeah. So, you know, this is sort of connected to the racial politics that you were mentioning earlier, and that we can get into more when we talk about the book specifically. But, you know, there are folks who lived during the Jim Crow era and are shaped by that politically. And what I've noticed is a particular trend among a subset of folks who do have like a racial first politics, and they will, you know, I call it waving the bloody shirt, right? Just like what, you know, they used to do in Congress for the War of 1812 or whatever, you know, the Civil War, you know, kind of wave the bloody shirt of the civil rights struggle and, you know, put that out there to defend what is ultimately basically conservative, moderate, pro-corporate politics, you know, the type of folks like Jim Clyburn. And that's representative of like the Alabama Democratic Conference, which is the Black Caucus here in Alabama Democratic Party, you know, is very much of that mold. And, you know, I guess it's no coincidence that tends to come from more middle and upper class Black folks and not working class Black folks. But I'm just wondering, like, what should we make of that? You know, the waving of the bloody shirt of civil rights to defend neoliberal lame politics.
Well, at first blush, it seems really ironic, especially for people who, know the history. But I got to say, first of all, because I'd be remiss if I didn't do this, but my friend Kenneth Warren, my good friend and comrade and collaborator, and is one of the two people I was having conversations with that led to this book. Ken always takes issue with our use of the bloody shirt metaphor. And I'll tell you why he does, because its origin, interestingly enough, was from what were then called the Republicans in the 1870s, who used the metaphor to attack those who didn't want to sacrifice Black rights to sort of getting beyond what they call the race issue at that point. So like his point is that the metaphor wasn't ours; it was theirs that they used against us. But anyway, but I just pass that on. There's no judgment. But he pointed out to me when I used it, right? So I mean, that's what the deal was. But yeah, well, see, I mean, here's the thing. Well, two things. One is a quip, and maybe the other will be a quip too. But the one quip is, when Thurgood Marshall retired from the Supreme Court, and Clarence Thomas had already been nominated to succeed him. And at a press conference, reporters asked him what he thought about Clarence Thomas as his successor. And Marshall, who was always kind of irascible, but even more so as he got older, which happens, said that when he was young, his father told him that if you're out on the road and see a black snake and a white snake coming at you, then you should kill the snake. Right. So the other one is that my good friend and comrade in South Carolina, Professor Willie Leggett, a few years ago, looked at the political scientist V.O. Key's classic book, Southern Politics and State and Nation, that was published in 1949. And he sent me an excerpt from his chapter on South Carolina and his discussion of the role that race played in South Carolina politics in 1949. And Leggett's point was that just by changing a handful of words, right, like in those passages, you could say the same thing about the role that race plays in South Carolina now. But and a difference would be that Black political elites are part of the game now too. So that a way we put it, and this is my first plug, but there's yet a newer book out, co-authored by me and my friend Walter Ben Michaels, who's like Ken Warren is a lit professor, called No Politics But Class Politics. And it's a collection of our essays and stuff over the years with 4 long interviews. But one of the points we make in that book is that just as racism has functioned as a vehicle to try to fool poor white people into identifying with rich white people instead of other poor Black people, contemporary anti-racism, right, no matter what it was in the past, but the way that anti-racist politics operates now is also a vehicle for trying to convince poor Black people to identify with rich Black people instead of with other poor white people. So, I mean, that's something to keep in mind as we think about, these formations like ADC and a legislative Black caucus in South Carolina and its alternative in Louisiana. And on that point, I'll tell you that Leggett and I, for more than 30 years, have had a playful debate going on as to which Black political class was the more reprehensible, the one in Louisiana or in South Carolina. And I push ahead sometimes, and he pushes back ahead, right, sometimes. But like Clyburn in 2016, Clyburn and John Lewis, right, icon of the civil rights movement from Alabama, went out on a limb to denounce Senator Sanders for advocating universal public goods, right, like education, right, and calling him irresponsible. And yeah, I mean, they definitely try to pimp the civil rights movement, right, as a way to justify what's an increasingly class-skewed agenda, or an increasingly blatant class-skewed agenda that they push, and I try to call it a racial agenda. And I mean, this is another point that Professor Leggett has made, and I just mentioned on another podcast that if there were a Nobel Prize for quips, like this one would definitely win. But he said that the only thing that hasn't changed about Black politics since 1965 is how we think about it, and everything is different. But when you think about how people want to talk about the stakes of Black political activity now, it's always by reference to something that makes them think about Jim Crow, or makes them think about slavery, right? Which is all, and that gets down to like removal of monuments and everything else, but it's all part of a more or less conscious effort to insist that nothing significant has changed for Black Americans, politically or socially for that matter, since 1965, when in fact the reality is that everything that's significant has changed for Black Americans since 1965. I mean, it's an anecdote, but I mentioned it in the book too. Like sometimes I'm out at like a Fats or a Chili's or whatever, and see a group of Black and white, and often enough Black, white, and Hispanic, South Asian coworkers, friends, or whatever, together having a drink or a business lunch or whatever. One thing that strikes me is that that's a simple activity that could not have happened as recently as 1960, right? I mean, nowhere in the region, right? I mean, not in Alabama, Louisiana, South Carolina, Georgia, right? I mean, we'll keep on going like a James Brown song. And I mean, that level of everyday interaction where people, and I'm not talking about love and brotherhood. I'm just talking about how people find themselves in social situations where they have to try to figure out how to get along together and make sense of one another and understand one another. And the whole point of Jim Crow was to make, and yeah, look, I would not deny that Pitchfork, Ben Tillman, or whichever the one was in Alabama, I forget, and Vardaman in Mississippi and all the rest of them. Yeah, I won't deny that they were sincere in their commitments to even a sometimes pornographically violent white supremacy, right? But the deeper point always was to keep black and white working people separate from each other and to keep them from forming the kind of alliances that the planter merchant capitalist class had feared from emancipation to the populist uprising, right? From happening again. And there were signs that they had something really to fear, right? The readjuster movement in Virginia in 1879, what was an interracial political movement, ironically led by a former Confederate colonel, I think, that took state power and changed tax laws and property laws to kind of tilt the playing field back a little bit for working people. And I mean, you had populism in Alabama was like that, and it must and in other states. So I mean, and God, North Carolina, a populist Republican fusion government won statewide in 1894, and then won again statewide in 1896 by an even bigger margin, and that's what prompted the ruling class to launch a putsch, right, a violent putsch, and that happened all around the South. So
right, absolutely. Right here in Alabama, same thing. We won, the people won in 1896 and it was stolen. And then, we had the 1901 Constitution imposed by a, fraudulent governor.
And if I remember correctly, there was one of those town coups in Alabama as well. I think Wilmington, North or South Carolina is really one of the North Carolina is one of the more popular ones. Hometown.
Oh, wow.
Okay, yeah. I think that's one of the more popularly known ones, especially kind of on the left online. But if I remember correctly, I think I've read about one here in Alabama.
I believe in Eufaula.
In Eufaula, maybe, where there was a black government elected and there was a white coup.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and see, this is the thing I don't understand, man. To be honest, maybe you guys have a take on it. That what we understand as progressive politics now. Right, it's all about denying that complex history, right? Like I was on a panel with historian Barbara Fields, right, at the Southern Historical Association meeting in Little Rock a number of years ago, and my talk was about this very issue, right? Like race, class, and populist uprising. And when the panel was over, and making the same points that we're making here. And when the panel was over, like a woman in the audience, apparently she was a certified historian, but she came up to me afterward and wanted to catechize me, not in a hostile or antagonistic way, but she wanted to catechize me about how populism failed, ultimately because white workers were more committed to white supremacy than they were to aligning themselves with black. So I said to her, well, yeah, there was some of that, to be sure, but there was also, violence, fraud, intimidation, murder, which kind of changes the incentives for people.
Adam,
she said to me,
that's a very familiar argument, isn't it, Adam?
Yeah. We've heard this before, unfortunately.
Well, yeah, I'm sure you have. And then she says to me, trumping, as it were, well, there was that too. But the real thing was, so I thought, well, what kind of world do you live in where like an abstract commitment to an ideology has greater impact on you than being beaten and threatened with lynching? You know what I mean?
Right.
But what's the point in that, right? And what does that do for us? And the answer that I've come to over the years increasingly is that by reinforce or by repeating the claim, and this is happening more and more and more in popular culture, right? And the reinvention of the civil rights movement, all of that stuff. And I think you're getting a sense of some of the concerns that led to, or that came out of this conversation that led to the book. But they all seem committed to hammering that Black people never have any allies, and the only hope for Black people is to do for self, basically. And that's not just a conservative line. That's a line saying that you can't do anything, and what you need, and this was also familiar given Alabama, is like a single race broker like Booker T. Washington, right? Who's on good terms with the ruling class, who can get stuff for Black people through some definition. And that leads to this observation, that it's been interesting watching the so-called racial wealth gap become the key marker for improvement of Black Americans' social and economic position, right? Because among other things, right, not only just closing a racial wealth gap, once again, sidestep the question of working in alliance with other people who are similarly placed within the society. But also, and Matt Brunig's work at the Progressive Policy Project has been great on this, that examination. So like most of the talk about the wealth gap proceeds from a formulation that the average Black person has X amount of wealth, where the average white person has 10 times as much wealth, right? But the reality is there's no such thing as the average Black person or the average white person, right? There's no such thing as collective white wealth, right? Like, I mean, like lately I've been saying that it's difficult maybe to think about Black people like this, because so much of us in American society now have been accustomed to thinking about Black people like they all think with one brain and all want the same thing, right, all the time. Like, even though the Black American population is larger than the total population of Canada, for instance. But maybe, so if you think about a white nurse, right, who's unemployed and about to have her house foreclosed on, or be evicted from her apartment. Can you imagine that there's like a reservoir of white wealth that she can go out to appeal to, right, to get help past our tough times, or take a teacup to Elon Musk's house, or one of them, but ask for some rent money, right, because we're all white here together? No, of course not. It's foolishness. And it's just as foolish about Black people. And then it turns out that close to 75% of so-called white wealth is controlled by the richest 10% of white people. And about 75% of so-called Black wealth is controlled by the richest 10% of Black people. And the bottom 50% of Blacks and whites have exactly the same amount of wealth, which is zero. So if you close the wealth gap, right, between the bottom half of Blacks and whites, 97% of the gap remains, right? So what closing the wealth gap is a program for narrowing the gap that separates the richest Black people from the richest white people. And I've talked to Black union members about this, and they see the point immediately, right? That the wealth gap has bupkis to do with them, right? And pardon this, just another digression on the same point. I'm sent you a quote from Senator Sanders before. I worked in both Sanders campaigns, and both times I had, as you might imagine, multiple experience of being approached by Black people as either individuals or small groups that asked why Senator Sanders didn't have a race program, or why he didn't address Black people's concerns directly. And whenever it happened, I did the same thing. I went down the platform item by item, and after each one, I asked, well, isn't this, like, if we won this, wouldn't Black people benefit, Blacks and Hispanics benefit disproportionately from it? And now the real moral of this story is that I had this encounter with two kinds of people, with working people, and every time I had it, with a working person. And I'm not exaggerating here. I'm really not. Once I did what I did, the response I got was, "Oh yeah, I see what you mean. It makes sense to me." Right? When I had that conversation with Black people from the PM or from the professional and the managerial strata, right, the middle, upper middle class people. First of all, they were more likely to ask the question with hostility, but secondly, they were much less likely to be persuaded by what I said because they weren't interested in an agenda of class-based redistribution. Why? Because they don't belong to the class that would benefit from it, right?
Right.
And that's the key point, right? So I don't know.
Well, and another illustration of that point is that Sam Cedar makes regularly on his program is that he was on a panel with Don Peebles, which is one of the 10 wealthiest Black folks in America. I think he's a billionaire. Wow. And they were on a panel arguing about the estate tax. And, as you might expect, Don Peebles was opposed to the estate tax. He was calling for its elimination. Right. And he was calling for its elimination on the basis of the racial wealth gap. Exactly what you said. Oh, yeah. He said that this is important in continuing familial wealth among the Black community. And,
which community?
Right.
Like,
I mean, specifically.
Where are they?
Yeah, I mean, it's specifically the community of the Peebles family, right? I mean, we can say that, but it's certainly not something. It's not something that Black or white working class folks, or even, I mean, even when we're talking about professional managerial folks, because the estate tax doesn't affect anybody that has an estate less than $40 million. So this is really the upper tier of anybody, Black or white or Hispanic or whatever. And the idea that Black folks should care about rich Black folks getting their billions of dollars passed down to, it's absurd. In the same way that I don't think that the Koch brothers' children should get any of their money. In fact, I think all of it should be taken away. But that's another conversation, I guess.
Now, something that you're really touching on here, and I wanted to make sure I mention this today, is that the first thing I think I ever read by you was an article you put out in 1996. Now, I didn't read it in 96, in all fairness. I was a little before my time, but
that's the year I was born.
Wow. Way to make me feel old, Jacob. Thanks for that. Yeah, appreciate it. I was good and born by then, but I came across your piece. I don't remember exactly when, but it was, early, my teenage years when I was waking up politically and had already seen the disappointments of the Obama presidency. And you pegged Obama back in 1996. I mean, you had him pegged. I think you exposed the kind of vacuous, empty neoliberal identity politics that animates so much of the Democratic Party then and now. And I think what you were speaking to just now is that despite the fact that the working class is the majority, the working class is the most diverse class. Right. So by definition, building working class power is building interracial people power. But there is a concerted effort to make class invisible.
Yeah, no, absolutely, man. And that's been true since at least the end of World War II. And social sciences, like in the U.S., played a very central role, like in doing that. And like this is something else I'm writing about now. Like partly, I'm doing a multi-part column in a Nation about how this came to pass. But I'm also like the book I'm trying to finish now that I got to get into Verso by the end of the summer is actually a study of this that we're calling when compromises come home to roost, and it's a study of the decline and transformation of the left since 1944, basically. But no, that's the key point, right? The key point is making class invisible, right? And look, I tell you about the Obama thing, man. Like I've gotten a lot of props over the years for having been pressing it, but I've often said that I have two mottos in life. One is that it's often better to be lucky than it is to be good. And the other is, it's often, if not usually, more important to be in the right place at the right time and pay attention with a kind of critical imagination than it is to be smart, right? And I just happened to be just wholly out of circumstances. It was unplanned. In effect, in the birthing room, right at the outset of Obama's political career. I lived in that state Senate district, and I worked closely with his predecessor in the office, and I was in the middle of the fight right over his effort to replace him. So I got to see the whole thing, right? So it's not like I was Nostradamus, right? I just got to watch to watch the bullshit play out in front of you. Excuse me.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, it's clear that was happening, right? And I mean, we could see it, for instance, in other instantiations, like the emergence of Cory Booker and a whole cohort of Black elected officials who were groomed in the foundation world, and often enough in the Broad Foundation and Walmart and others.
It's interesting you bring up Broad.
Charter school militants. Yeah.
Because I cut my teeth as an organizer fighting against a Broad Academy superintendent here in Huntsville.
Oh,
so,
here. Excellent. Congratulations.
So, so I definitely know about Cory Booker. That's for sure.
Okay, I bet you do. Yeah, I bet you do. But see, the thing is, right, and this says something about how relentless their concern to consolidate class power is, and to de-democratize the entire society, right? That they didn't have any substantive problems with the previous cohort of Black elected officials, right? The ones who had come up through, street fighting ethnic pluralism, like in local and state Democratic parties. Especially in big cities. But the problem that they had with them, right, because they did everything that they were supposed to do from the standpoint of big capital and foundations. But the problem with the Broad types, or the problem that the Broad types had with them, was that earlier group of politicians, which included Sharp James, the person who Cory succeeded in Newark, was having come up through regular democratic politics, they'd had to deal with public sector unions and with teachers unions in particular, and were inclined to give and take and to negotiate. But what these upper class funders wanted was a ramrod who would come in and operate in totally undemocratic ways and impose their will. And that's where we've been for a long time. And I'll say this about Obama too, which is probably going to make some people's heads explode, though that's not my intention. But Obama was elected telling us that because of who he was, and keep in mind, right, I mean, this is after the Great Recession, telling us that by virtue of who he was, he would address our concerns and losses, right, after the economic crisis. And of course, he did nothing. But who he was partly because of who he was racially, right? If you go back and look at his speeches and read his sad little memoirs, right, I mean, you'll see that, right? He's got these statements about how, because I'm somebody whose grandmother lives on the shores of Lake Victoria and I have an Indonesian stepsister or whatever, or half-sister. So a lot of people who voted for Obama naively or hopefully thinking that because he was who he said he was, or because of who he was, he had some magical way that he was going to deliver us, didn't. And guess what happens? Well, next comes a guy who is the equal and opposite version of Obama, selling the same phony stuff, but in an uglier way, and appealing more like to desperation. And that's where we are.
Adolph Reed Jr. His book is The South, Jim Crow and Its Afterlives. You can get it online. It is a co-publication of Verso and Jacobin Magazine. Really enjoyed the book. Really enjoyed the conversation, Professor Reed. We weaved in and out of the book, I think, and so we hit some of the topics tangentially. But it's a really good book. Yep. I highly recommend folks getting it and checking out his writing in other places. Really appreciate your time. Anything you want to leave us with before we head into our final break and pay a couple bills before we're off the radio at 11?
Please, two kind of shameless plugs. One I mentioned already is my new book with Walter Ben Michaels called No Politics But Class Politics. But more important is the Debs Jones Douglas Institute, which is the 501c3 created by the Labor Party. Podcast. It's called classmatterspodcast.org. And it's and the tagline for our podcast is we're the place where we discuss what the country would look like if it were governed by and in the interests of the working class. And our most recent episode is a great discussion with Jane McAlevey, who I mentioned before, and Gordon Lafer. That's kind of around her new book, Rules to Win By, about how to win bargaining. But all of our episodes, and that's the 12th episode, and all 12 of them connect directly with working people's concerns. So I urge everybody to check it out. And awesome. And we'll plug you guys too, of course.
Thank you. Yeah, I think y'all are also... I was just going to say that y'all are also part of the Labor Radio Podcast Network, which we are very proud to be a part of. And I spoke to your co-host on one of the meetings a couple weeks ago. Mm-hmm. Right.
Oh, yeah, that's right. She mentioned that to me. So, and my last question, you cut this, but those, can you send me a link to the broadcast you recorded, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
We
will do that. And thank you so much for your time. We really do appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks a lot, guys.
Yep.
All right.
Take care, brothers.
Take care.
Yep. All right, folks. Like I said, Adolph Reed Jr., The South, Jim Crow and Its Afterlives. You can. It's a co-publication of Verso, Jacobin Magazine. Really great book. He is he's in the last cohort of people to make it through Jim Crow, with actual living adult memory. So I think that experience is really worth understanding from the perspective of Black folks, and it's fascinating. It's a great book. So.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.